It is May 2nd, 1982, at 15:57 hours, near the Burwood Banks, just outside the 200 miles exclusion zone. HMS Conqueror has just fired 3 non-homing torpedoes at her target. These torpedoes very quickly closed the distance. The first one punched through near the bow of the ship, but did not penetrate the frontal torpedo bulge of the ship. The second torpedo hit around 3/4 of the way aft on the ship, rapidly penetrating the armor near a machine room on the aft side of the ship. The blast rocked the ship, an explosion blowing upward all the way through to the deck above, through 2 ship's messes and a relaxation area called the soda fountain, creating a 20-foot hole in the vessel. It is estimated that some 275 sailors were killed with this blast. Despite sailing at action stations, the ship's watertight doors were not sealed, and water quickly began to pour in. To make matters worse, electrical systems had been damaged by the blast. Pumps, radios, lighting had all been knocked out. The ship was doomed. The captain immediately called out for his sailors to abandon ship, while her 2 escorts sailed ahead, unaware of what just happened to their much larger companion as it slipped underneath the waves. This was the sinking of the ARA General Belgrano, the only ship to have been sunk in a torpedo attack by a nuclear submarine, and one of only 3 warships sunk by submarine since the end of World War II. The submarine has earned a reputation as being a silent hunter since the days of the First World War. When the scourge of the U-boats first was launched onto the world stage of the Great War, the public were horrified by the thought of unrestricted submarine warfare. Many in the military and the public around the world thought it to be cowardly and ungentlemanly to conduct warfare in this manner. To attack without warning against a target that may or may not be armed, and silently slip away as the ship sinks to the bottom, leaving the crew and any possible passengers to fend for themselves in the cold waters of the Atlantic Ocean or North Sea. With warships, merchant vessels, and passenger ships all falling victim to the menace of the silent hunter, the mystique of the submarine grew. By the end of the war, almost 5,000 ships were sunk, with a loss of only 178 U-boats and 5,000 sailors. When World War II began in September 1939, the world again was forced into the realm of unrestricted submarine warfare. In an action that is now arguably called the longest battle of the Second World War, the Battle of the Atlantic began. New tactics, like that of the Wolf Pack, the massing of U-boats to attack convoys together and spread the escorts thin, proved very effective early on. The U-boats, aided by the lack of technology on the part of the Allies, in particular Great Britain and the United States, preyed upon the merchant vessels trying to supply the British. The U-boats were also aided by the German Kriegsmarine, using their major surface ships as commerce raiders in the early years of the war. By the time of the attack on Pearl Harbor and the subsequent entrance of the United States into the war, the U-boats were enjoying what they had called their first happy time. A total of 282 ships were sunk by U-boats in the northern approaches to the British home islands. But the good times would not last. By the time the war ended, the U-boats had gone from being the hunters to the hunted. Advances in sonar, radar, and anti-submarine weapons had taken their toll on the U-boats. The anti-submarine warfare tactics proved so successful that by the time of the Normandy landings on D-Day, not a single soldier that was to take part in the landings were lost to U-boat actions while crossing the Atlantic. Over 3,500 vessels were sunk by all enemy actions during the Battle of the Atlantic. In the war in the Pacific, the Allies, taking a page from the Germans' own playbook, began their own campaign of unrestricted undersea warfare against the Japanese. This campaign proved to be much more successful against the Japanese than the Kriegsmarine was against the Allies in the Battle of the Atlantic. The Japanese Navy was ill-equipped to deal with the submarine threat. At the beginning of the campaign, Allied submarines could attack and dive away to relative safety after an attack due to the inexperience of the Japanese destroyers in targeting submarines. This changed after a U.S. Congressman, Andrew J. May, revealed that Japanese destroyers were setting their depth charges too shallow to attack American submarines in an interview with the press in 1943. Though this did make the Japanese destroyers more of a threat, it did not change the outcome. Estimates vary, but somewhere between 2,500 to 15,000 ships were sunk by the Allied submarine campaign. The campaign was an overwhelming success to the victory against Japan. The success of the campaign may well have led to the reduction in the sentence of Admiral Karl Dönitz during the war crimes tribunals at Nuremberg. U.S. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz provided Dönitz a statement, saying his submarines in the Pacific acted no differently against Japan. Through 2 world wars, the submarine began to be seen as a weapon that could silently complete their missions. Anything from sabotage to shelling of ground installations, attacking shipping, whether merchant or warship, rescuing downed pilots that have ejected, deploying and re-embarking intelligence officers and special forces behind enemy lines, or even doing surveys from periscope depth to recon coastlines and harbors for obstacles and other dangers. After the war, with the creation of the ballistic missile and the atomic bomb, a new purpose for the submarine was being developed. The unseen and unheard silent warrior would now be armed with the most powerful weapons man has ever devised. On September 16, 1955, a converted Soviet Project 611, also called a Zulu 4 class submarine, became the first submarine in the world to launch what would become known as an SLBM, or Sub-Launched Ballistic Missile. The missile was an R-11FM, a naval variant of the SS-1A, also known as the Scud missile. By 1956, the Soviet Union had launched 5 Project 611Vs, or Zulu 5 class submarines, becoming the first ballistic missile submarines in the world. With the advent of nuclear propulsion, the United States followed suit with the USS George Washington, which entered service in 1959 as the world's first SSBN, or Nuclear Ballistic Missile Submarine, colloquially called boomers. On July 20th of 1960, the George Washington became the first submarine to launch a missile while still submerged, and thus began the great submarine arms race between the Soviet Union and the United States, a Cold War that involved many combatants over the decades to follow. Nuclear-powered and diesel-powered sub-hunters prowled the deep. Sonar nets were deployed around some of the more commonly used transit routes to get into the Atlantic Ocean and the North Sea. Games of cat and mouse took place on a regular basis, boomers lurking in the waters off the coasts of their intended targets, acting like a silent hole in the ocean, the hunters trying to find them. If the diplomatic situation were to ever break down and a shooting war were to happen, many submarines and their crews deployed, armed and ready to do what was necessary for victory. The submarines would get very close, in some cases even scraping against one another in the process. Yet, throughout all of it, not a single torpedo was ever fired at an enemy submarine, nor a single warship or merchant ship sunk until this day in May of 1982 by a nuclear submarine. And even more amazing, only one ship before, the INS Kukri, an Indian Navy frigate, was the only warship prior to the sinking of the Belgrano since the end of World War II. Even more amazing, a total of 22 submarines, including nuclear and conventional submarines, have sunk since the end of World War II, the majority lost to accidents and not as a result of enemy fire. An even more astounding fact is that only 2 and a possible 3rd ship have been sunk by submarine since the end of World War II. The submarine is a very powerful weapon, but this power hides the dangers inherent with using these weapons in the navies of the world. For starters, there are only a few countries capable of producing submarines for the navies. Even fewer can produce nuclear-powered submarines. The submarine is very expensive to build and maintain, especially if nuclear-powered. To build a so-called boomer requires even more expertise than does a nuclear sub-hunter like that of a Virginia-class or an Akula-class submarine. For every mission that a submarine can do, there are a large number of variables they must account for in order to do them successfully and get away unscathed. With sensors such as sonar and radar becoming even more effective over time, the danger of detection has increased, especially since computers and software have gotten more powerful as well. A submarine risks a lot to even come close for an attack, especially if it is a torpedo attack like HMS Conqueror achieved against the General Belgrano. The General Belgrano was not traveling alone. They had an escort of 2 destroyers with them, which at any moment could detect the submarine and launch their own search to find and destroy the British submarine. The submarine also had to be relatively shallow in order to be able to see the cruiser. The most effective way of getting the bearings and speed needed for a successful solution for the unguided torpedo to score hits. This means an even greater chance of being detected. Once the torpedoes are fired, the submarine risks even further detection from the sound it launches, and then after the target is hit, the submarine has to escape from the area, especially now against a possibly angry and vengeful foe looking for some payback against the assassin. And yet with all of this, HMS Conqueror slipped away undetected. The same is true for the sinking of the ROK Navy corvette Chonan on March 26, 2010, by a North Korean torpedo attack. Despite being a ship capable of hunting submarines itself, the ship detected nothing as it patrolled the waters before being struck by at least 1, possibly 2 torpedoes. However, despite their successes against these 3 warships, the use of a submarine since the end of World War II has proven to be more dangerous for their own crews than to the enemy. From the US Navy with the Thresher and the Scorpion, the Soviet Union and the Russian Navy with the loss of the Kursk, the Mike class, and others, to the Argentinian Navy with the loss of the Santa Fe in 2017, and to the loss of the KRA Nanggala by the Indonesian Navy. These losses and others by navies around the world highlight the dangers, especially to navies without the money or the ability to effectively repair and maintain them. So the question is, with the exception of the very few navies in the world with the money and expertise to maintain their submarines, is the submarine's day in combat officially over? Will we ever see a return to unrestricted undersea warfare, the likes of the First and Second World War? Or are these weapons simply too complex to be built and maintained by the majority of the navies? With the days of nuclear deterrence being more or less relegated to the history books, is there even a necessity for the boomers in this modern world? Both the US and the Russian Federation seem to think so. Even with repurposing and arming submarines with cruise missiles to undertake attacks against land targets, have we seen the decline of the submarine from the weapons chest around the world? We thank you for listening to this podcast. Combat Ineffective would like to thank our supporters on Patreon who have stuck by us through our hiatus and now as we transition to this new media format for the near term. If you wish to support this podcast, please go to www.patreon.com/combatineffective for more details on how you too can support the great content on this channel. Check out our website at www.combatineffective.com. It has links to all our previous videos, as well as links to our Patreon, Facebook page, and Twitter feed.